Most debates about addressing poverty focus on incremental changes to the current social welfare system. But are we at a point where what the country needs is actually a wholesale replacement of the system?
The current system encourages and sometimes forces people to behave like victims.
On this episode, we sit down with renowned author and policy scholar Charles Murray to hear his proposal for replacing the entire welfare state with just one program. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This year, Sutherland Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary, thanks to all those who support the work we do for Utah and our great nation. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and my guest this week is Charles Murray. Dr. Murray holds the F.A. Hayek Chair Emeritus in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's also a prolific author and conservative thinker. He's written books like Losing Ground, The Bell Curve, Coming Apart, and what we're going to be talking about today in particular, the book In Our Hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State. Dr. Charles Murray, thanks for being with us on Defending Ideas.
That's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
I appreciate you lending your time and expertise to this discussion and your body of work for many, many years. I was telling you before we started recording that I read the book Losing Ground years ago, earlier on in my career, that really helped set the stage for some of the ways I think we need to reform the social safety net to be more truly upwardly mobile. So I want to thank you for the body of work you've offered to help those conversations happen as a nation. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, because your book, In Our Hands, we'll get into some details about it, but essentially you're providing this aspirational vision to totally replace the welfare system in this country for reasons that we'll get into. I wonder if I could ask you to start, when you look at the current social safety net in this country, what is wrong with it today that prompts you to think we need to think about wholesale replacement of the system?
Well, let's start with the fact that I had to look up recent budget numbers because In Our Hands, the most recent version, was done 10 years ago. So a lot of my budget figures from them are out of date. But right now we're at about $4 trillion per year on social welfare spending, if you combine everything. $4 trillion. The purpose of all this is to make sure that people are not living in poverty and have comfortable lives in old age and medical care and so forth. And guess what? We still have millions of people who are not living comfortable lives in old age and are not receiving adequate medical care and a variety of other problems. And the thought that occurs to me is only a government can spend money that inefficiently. And if you're talking about that kind of money, the proposition of let's just give them the cash has a certain intuitive plausibility. But let me give you three other reasons that have been becoming more apparent over the last decade. One is that we need to do something radical because of the budget deficits. I mean, this is not nearly as big a topic as it should be. We are looking at catastrophe, not 100 years down the road, but much sooner than that. With the budget deficits we're running, we will have no choice at some point but to do something about it. A second thing is that we have the increasing breakdown of working class families in America that was pretty bad when I was writing before, whether you're talking about single women with children, whether you're talking about able-bodied men out of the labor force, all of that's gotten worse in a variety of ways. And the third thing is what's coming down the pike with artificial intelligence. Now, I have all sorts of conservative and libertarian friends who tell me people have been saying this since the Luddites, that technology is going to displace jobs. Well, I got news for you. We are not talking about replacing strong backs with machines. We're talking about millions of jobs that are now done by people who have above average intelligence and college degrees. And the reason they got those jobs is because they can make judgments that are worth that money. And it's not very long now before AI will be making judgments every bit as good or better than the people who are making these salaries. We're not talking about a small segment of working class whose jobs are in jeopardy. We're talking about a big chunk of the middle class. So to put all those things together, we got to do something dramatic.
Is that why you kind of would lean towards sort of an aspirational wholesale replacement of the system rather than incremental reforms? And obviously, the way things kind of work in policy generally, of course, in Washington, D.C. as well, typically they're sort of small incremental reforms. You tinker here and there. Part of that's just political realities. But would you argue that incremental reform is not going to get us there because of these existential reasons you're outlining, that we do need to do something more robust?
Oh, come on. All we have to do is look at history. We have had crises in the welfare system of various sorts, especially funding of Social Security, going back decades now, and just look at the record of wimpy lack of courage on the part of presidents and Congresses in tackling any of these. So that, for example, entitlements are off the table, apparently during the Trump administration. Well, I got news for you that they may be off the table as far as he is concerned, but they are not off the table in terms of the problems that they are creating. Nick, I really think we can come back to this later. I really think that as long as we try to say, here's a path from A to Z, step by step that will work, we're kidding ourselves.
One of the things I want to ask you as well is when I look at this issue, and I will admit up front that I'm still a little bit skeptical of the actual universal basic income plan you propose, though it is incredibly compelling. So I'm excited to get into some of those details here shortly. But I look at these things in terms of how these programs affect people in poverty who desperately want out, who are hungry for earned success, to use an Arthur Brooks term, who they want to work, they're trying to work, but I think that the term you use in the book is voluntary poverty versus involuntary poverty, that folks who fall in the involuntary poverty category are those who are doing everything right. They're working, they're trying to earn more and earn their way out of poverty, but the nature of the system for some folks makes it really hard to do that at times. So I think about those families in particular, and I'm curious to your thoughts. When you look at the current safety net system, are there things that stand out to you that are harming or limiting the ability of these impoverished families to move up and out of poverty and achieve the American dream, that help add motivation to you for why we need more robust reform?
Sure, they all boil down to the ways in which the current system encourages and sometimes forces people to behave like victims. And by that, I mean you get the assistance from the social welfare system if you can prove that your life is messed up, or that you've messed up, or that you are in some other way in a situation beyond your control. And what we know without a doubt is bureaucrats are very, very incompetent at providing the feedback to people with these problems that get them to change their behavior and do better. Let me give you a really simple example of what happens if you have a basic income that everybody knows is coming into our person's account every month electronically. And let's say that he's living with his girlfriend, he doesn't have a job, and he is living off her, but he goes home and says, well, honey, I look for work, but there's just these chump change jobs and they're demeaning and all that. And right now, she has no way to say to him, wait a minute, I happen to know that you've got X number of dollars hitting the bank account the first of the month. How about chipping in? If you give somebody an income stream, they acquire agency. They can be treated as a person who has some control over their lives. Or let's say this, a thing I often hear when I talk about the universal basic income is, oh, people will just drink it away or shoot it up their arms. Well, they're doing that right now, but you have a difference, which is, again, they can no longer say to their girlfriend, to their siblings, to their parents, to their friends, what can I do? What you can do is get your act together. We aren't going to let you starve this month. You've used up all of your income for this month, but you better stop doing this or we're going to cut you off. And if that doesn't work, you're going to end up having to go to the Salvation Army. I'm talking about establishing the only effective feedback loops we can ever hope for with people who are dysfunctional for reasons that they do, in fact, have some power over for. The only way we're going to establish those feedbacks is by giving people agency, and an income stream does that.
Charles, in a minute, we'll take a quick break. I want to come back. I want to get into the details of your book again, In Our Hands. We'll include links to where you can get the book in the show notes. Before we do that, I want to ask you, before we go to break, if we do nothing as a country, let's just say the current safety net system in all respects stays exactly the same, what happens in terms of the folks in need, in terms of impact on taxpayers and the country as a whole?
I mean, the temptation, Nick, is to say we're doomed. But let me be a little more specific than that. If we stay on this current system, don't change it at all, we better find some really huge sources of revenue that we don't have now because we are not going to be able to afford it. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to pay the piper. This debt you cannot keep accumulating debt as we have, and there will be some kind of crisis. That crisis could take many forms politically, but it can't go on forever. And we are looking down at the road at, if we don't take action now, probably a crisis which is some kind of revolution and unlikely to be a good one.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get into the details of some of the things you propose in your book. Again, this is Defending Ideas, talking with Charles Murray. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We've been talking with Charles Murray, author of the book In Our Hands, a plan to replace the welfare state. And we're going to get into some of the details of what he proposes that replacement should look like. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org or search for us wherever you like to get your shows. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you prefer to watch, find us on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you're watching right now, click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that and more at defendingideas.org. Charles, let's kind of get into the details of what you propose, because in your book, you essentially lay out this idea that, well, let's take everything, and I mean kind of everything that we would think of as far as our social welfare system today, let's kind of just throw it out the window and replace it with what you call a universal basic income. Can you just kind of walk us through, give us the overview of what you propose?
Sure. And first, I want to emphasize everything. So I'm not talking about Medicaid and anti-poverty programs. I'm also talking about income transfers through Social Security, through Medicare. I'm talking about all kinds of times in which the government takes our tax dollars and gives them to other individuals. And if you take all of that and cash it out, you have easily affordable, in fact, much less than our current system, a universal basic income. In the 2014 version of this book, I was saying it's going to be $10,000 a year per person aged 21 and older, plus $3,000 that must be devoted to purchasing a catastrophic health insurance policy. Those numbers would have to be higher if I were doing the program again now. How much higher, I have not tried to go through all the numbers again. Let's say, for purposes of the discussion, it's $15,000 in cash plus an additional sufficient to buy catastrophic health insurance. That is deposited into a known bank account electronically every month, automatically in equal installments, to every citizen in the United States 21 and older, including people who are making millions of dollars a year. Why do that? Well, one thing is that right now you have costs that are levied on people making all income levels for Social Security and Medicare. And somehow you've got to compensate them in some way for what they're being asked to give up through a universal basic income. Okay, so that's coming into your bank account. And what I want to emphasize, that's it. You do not any longer have the option of trying to get help from the government to deal with any of your personal problems. That's all gone, whether you're talking about in-kind or whether you're talking about services or anything else. And that is, to me, one of the great benefits of the program, which is it can revitalize private institutions in a way that's just hard to imagine. One of the things that people do not do is look at how incredibly extensive voluntary philanthropic efforts were in the 19th century and early 20th century before government got involved. If you were to extrapolate the resources put into helping the poor to today's dollars and today's national wealth from what it was in 1900, you'd have expenditures that are not far behind federal welfare expenditures, but we undercut all that. So that's the basics. You also have a system for allowing people to keep the bulk of their grant up to a certain income level, and even after that, it's reduced only moderately. Again, I'll have to try to revise my figures from 2015 to today, but it would be, let's say, up to earned income of $40,000. You keep the entire grant. So when you're at $40,000, you have $55,000, all right? And if you are a couple that making $40,000 each, you are now up at 80 plus 30 is 110. You start to lose some after that, but the work disincentive is very small. There are very few people who are going to quit $40,000 a year job because their $15,000 has been reduced by $700 for going over 40. This, I think, pretty well sidesteps most of the work disincentives that have plagued assistance programs since their outset.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because the work disincentives issue, that's something that is a big focus of what we do here at Sutherland Institute. We've been putting out some research and working on some policy reforms specifically to address benefit cliffs in the current social safety net, which for our audience, again, is when somebody earns a little bit more in terms of earned income, and that triggers a loss of benefits through things like food stamps or Medicaid or other programs that can, eat up most of or more than the income gain. And we have survey data showing it is a real work disincentive for a substantial number of folks on these programs. And so that really resonates with me. Can you talk a little bit more about how this proposal, in your estimation, would it have any work disincentives at all, or would it incentivize work in kind of a universal way?
Well, of course, one possibility is that people take their $15,000 and get out of the labor force and get along on that. Well, you can do that because $15,000 does not buy you a comfortable living, but it could be done. And if you have two people, that's $30,000, so that's a little bit easier. On the other hand, every dime you earn, if you decide to supplement that a little bit, you get to keep. So that if you have something you want and you can't buy it with this sort of slender guaranteed income, there is a real easy solution to that. I'm not going to get a 40-hour-a-week job, but maybe I'll go pick up a part-time job until I can buy what it is I want. You have all sorts of ways in which getting earned income is pure profit. And that's a big deal. A second thing I'd like to emphasize, Nick, is this business about if you want to have a comfortable income, it's really good if you can cooperate with someone else. And the easiest way to cooperate, besides roommates, which is always possible, is getting married. All right. And so you're now talking about a big difference in all of the calculations that go into marriage decisions, which we could go into in detail. I will say briefly for people who haven't read the book, I find these parts of the book some of the most fun to read and to write because some of the dynamics, well, let me just give you a quick example. Right now, if you are an unmarried woman and you have a baby, you get lots of money. By lots, generous support. If you are on a universal basic income, you're getting 15 grand, you have a baby, those diapers are all coming out of your 15 grand. So is all of the other things you have to pay for. It's pure loss. All right. Now tell me how that will affect the calculations of 18 and 19-year-old girls who are watching their older sisters or older friends, some of whom have gotten their own apartment with a roommate and are going to night school and doing things to get ahead, and others who are still living in miserable circumstances, paying for the diapers and all the child care costs. That's called a deterrent to having a baby without someone else to support it. Similarly, Nick, suppose that the man has no legal rights over a child at all unless he gets married. That creates a real incentive for the woman to demand that a guy who wants to live with her and sleep with her has to marry her, because otherwise there's no way she can get child support from him. You sort of see the idea. The universal basic income that I talked about earlier in the broadcast, the agency it gives means that all sorts of demands can be made on people and all sorts of expectations can change in very positive ways.
That and what you mentioned earlier in the first segment about this idea of revitalizing, I think, civic institutions or private institutions. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The marriage piece obviously being important, but also when you talked about charitable giving and private charity and those kinds of things, I'd love to just hear you tell our audience more about how you think this plan would revitalize our civic institutions and sort of that layer of civic life that I think we all recognize has been seriously eroded in the modern era.
Well, a lot of what goes on when the governments get into these businesses is that the people who were formerly engaged in those get out of it because the government's spending these huge sums of money. And so why should I be doing that? And you can look at the history of philanthropic giving, and during the New Deal, all sorts of money that had formerly been going to people in need was going to the opera or to libraries or other things that are good, but being taken out of that. A second thing is that this remains an extremely generous country in terms of the people. And Utah is as good a state as an example of that as we have ever seen. And that is, if tomorrow all of these programs went away, Americans, it is not in their nature to say, well, who cares? And you will have all sorts of people who have been enthusiastically advocating for the poor, who I would like to think, if those programs go away, will be devoting their energy to helping them, but also lots of people who are on the sidelines and devoting their energies to other things will get engaged in these efforts, whether they are through the church or whether they are civic organizations. Those organizations are still out there. And for all the people who live not in the New York or San Francisco or megalopolis areas, but live in cities of 15,000 or 75,000 or 120,000, knows that the civic activism that goes on is still very much like Alexis de Tocqueville described it in the 1830s. All sorts of voluntary organizations. And they will, if you get rid of the government, blossom again.
I want to spend a little more time before we go to the next break on some of the aspects of the plan you propose, because I think it's really important to the discussion. And there's two aspects you dive into in the book. One is healthcare, and the other is poverty specifically. And I want to ask about healthcare because you make the point in the book that you argue the current healthcare system or the health insurance system sort of removes the consumer from the position of choosing or making decisions with respect to their own healthcare and the expenditures on their healthcare. Can you expand on that a little bit in terms of why is that a critique of the current system that we need to know, and how this plan would help fix that?
Start by thinking that the costs of routine healthcare should have been plummeting over the last 50 years. Instead, they've been rising steeply, but think of all the ways in which things are cheaper than they used to be, whether it's using adhesives to close wounds instead of having to have them stitched up, whether it is a pill to control blood pressure, whereas before you had no way of controlling blood pressure, whether it's surgical instruments that can be much less invasive and get people out of hospitals faster. You should be able to take care of routine healthcare costs the same way you take care of buying shoes and keep doing the upkeep in your car. They should be that inexpensive. Then if you get to catastrophic healthcare, you are talking about potentially being bankrupted. And because things are genuinely really expensive for catastrophic healthcare, well, guess what? Insurance companies, if you tell them this person is coming onto your rolls for catastrophic health insurance at the age of 21 and can pay $4,000 a year, guaranteed ad infinitum, those health insurance companies can afford to have a very solid catastrophic health care insurance policy because they will use your younger, healthy self to pay for your older, sick self. This is not rocket science. It is not coming up with weird new ideas. You're talking about doing the same thing in healthcare that has produced computers which cost the same raw dollar cost in 2025 that they cost in 1984. You could buy an Apple computer in 1984 with 128K of memory for $2,500 in those dollars. You can buy a supercomputer for $2,500 today from the same company. We can do that with healthcare.
On poverty as well, obviously you orient a lot of this towards alleviating poverty. And I want to pinpoint one aspect of what you say in the book, because you essentially define poverty as the lack of means to provide for basic material needs for folks. And I want to kind of offer an analogy where I tend to think of poverty differently than solely a lack of material resources. And the analogy I use is that if you or I had a friend or a relative, come to you and say, "Hey, I'm down on my luck. I lost my job. I don't have a place to stay." And if you said out of the goodness of your heart, sleep on my couch, stay in my basement, eat whatever you want out of the fridge. You're fine. Don't worry about it until you get back on your feet. If that were me, if I were then to go and say, "Hey, I solved poverty for my brother or my friend or so and so," they're not poor anymore because they're essentially living under the auspices of my material resources. That would kind of be viewed as silly. Like, no, they're still in poverty. They are just able to meet their material needs for now until they get back on their feet. And so I throw that out. I'd love to hear your response to the definition of poverty as purely lack of material resources versus the definition of poverty as a lack of the ability to generate earned success to achieve work-based self-reliance. Maybe two different ways of looking at it, but how do you respond?
Yeah, when I talk about thinking of poverty purely in terms of material resources, I use that as an illustration of how easy it is to eradicate poverty. All you have to do is give them the money. Then they may misuse it or they may not, but if they're in poverty at that point, it's their own fault. And they don't need to be in poverty. But what you really want is the other elements of what I consider to be happiness, such as self-respect. And you cannot fake it with self-respect. You cannot have people say to you, "Oh, it's not your fault." You need to have a sense that you're pulling your weight. And if you don't have that sense, you are not a happy person. And in other ways, if you do not have intimate relationships with other human beings, which usually involve some kind of interdependence, you are not happy by my understanding of happiness. So I consider solving the monetary problem of poverty to be one of the least important in terms of the benefits. What I'm looking at are all the ways in which it is going to increase the earned success, which doesn't have to necessarily be defined in terms of income, the earned success of a lot of people who right now are living lives that are bereft of that.
Well, Charles, let's take one quick break. When we come back, I want to sort of see if we can meld together what you've offered as critiques or concerns about the current safety net system, the framework of the plan you outlined in your book, and then kind of ask, well, if someone out there is listening to this and thinking some of this or all of this is really interesting or compelling to me, I want to talk about sort of next steps in terms of practically speaking, what chance is there for more robust reforms, whether it's exactly what you outline or elements of that in the social safety net here in the United States. So let's take that quick break. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Charles Murray. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Charles Murray, author of the book In Our Hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State. And before we finish the conversation with Dr. Murray, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you like to get your shows. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're also on YouTube if you subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And make sure to click the little bell icon in the corner to get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. You can find all of that and more on all the major platforms and at defendingideas.org. Charles, the last things I want to talk to you about are essentially, what do we do with this information? For anyone listening out there who thinks either they love this plan and they just want to wholesale try and get the country to adopt it, or if there are elements of it that are really compelling to them, just bottom line, if our folks out there are thinking, yes, we need to reform the social safety net, and we need to move in a direction that is more truly upwardly mobile, that is more oriented toward the revitalization of civil society. What's next? What do we do? What are some things that have been on your mind as far as taking any of this or all of this from ideation to execution?
I'm smiling, Nick, because for years now I have been saying to people, I'm a libertarian, and libertarians don't do solutions. and there is an element of truth to that, especially if you're a libertarian, because it is so out of whack with anything that seems politically realistic. And so then when I'm asked, yeah, but let's get serious now and give me some practical first steps, I'm saying if I knew what they were, I would have put them in the book. However, some possibilities. We were just talking about medical care. What I was saying about routine medical care should have been getting cheaper is really true. And what we have observed about out of control medical care rising costs is really true. And if we come to a financial crisis, this might be one of the ways in which there will be more political sympathy for a system which says, by any measure of quality of medical care, this is going to be an improvement, but it will cost a fifth of what we're currently spending by the government for medical care. If you can make that kind of argument, and it's one where you have the same level of agreement among economists and experts that you have about rent control, then maybe there is hope for progress. But of course, as soon as I say that, I'm thinking to myself, you're about to elect a mayor of New York who wants to expand rent control, despite the fact that economists all say it's a really stupid idea. So the persistence of stupidity on the part of our politicians is really stunning. But there will be some things if we are in a situation where we just don't have the money anymore. where that can be, okay, we aren't getting rid of Social Security, but we are going to fix the medical care system. Conceivable that kind of thing could happen. Uh, I'll tell you, though, another argument that I personally find among the most compelling is not that the plan lifts people out of poverty, material poverty, but that enables people who've gotten the short end of the stick but are trying hard a chance to live a comfortable life. Let's go back to the example of somebody who's working a minimum wage job. Let's say these days it's going to work out to be about $10 an hour. Say it's 2,000 hour year. So you're talking about a $20,000 income, which is not comfortable income. But if both of them are doing, if you have a marriage where both of them have that minimum wage job, 40 hours a week, well, that's $40,000. And then you tack on $30,000 for the guaranteed income. All at once they're up to 50. I'm sorry, they're up to 70 at that point. And you're talking even 2025 at 70 grand a year, you can live a solid middle class life. That is, to me, a wonderful benefit of this program, because it is true we do not earn our IQs, and IQs are really important for making money these days. For that matter, we are not gifted with beauty or charm or any of the other assets. They're all gifts we should be deeply grateful for, and some people got the short end of the stick on all of them. And I would like to see a route to a comfortable living for those people, and this plan provides that. If you can convert the argument into some very deep problems with inequality and say it's not just we're trying to lift people barely above the poverty line, but we are trying to make the good life more widely available to all Americans, that has an appeal that ending poverty doesn't have. Ending poverty is talking about a problem. I'm talking about a good thing for tens of millions of Americans that most other Americans would like to see them have. That's not a practical solution, Nick, but it is in conjunction with a fiscal crisis. It is these kinds of arguments that are going to take people who on the left as well as the right, perhaps, and say, you aren't being hard-hearted at this point. You are trying to use limited resources in a far more effective way to help people than we're using them now.
Charles, there's a lot that you're saying that's so compelling to me. As I said, I think at the outset of this discussion, I think I'm still kind of processing the details of the plan you're proposing here, because it's incredibly interesting, and I think of it in terms of if those of us who consider ourselves champions of upward mobility or helping more Americans to move closer to the American dream, then I think we need to be talking in these terms of it is not just about alleviating poverty as sort of limiting a bad thing, but it's about empowering people to live more flourishing lives, whether that comes in respect to their material needs or their engagement with civic institutions and revitalizing those. And so I think those high-level principles I want to sort of impress on the minds of our audience. And I wonder, one of the things that we try and push for a lot here at Sutherland in our safety net reform work broadly is this idea that trying to fix all these things purely from the perspective of the federal government is really challenging politically, from a policy standpoint, for a whole host of reasons. So one of the things that I've been trying to push for is more state-level flexibility to try innovative, outside-the-box solutions. If a state wanted to try what you're proposing or wanted to pull some parallels from some of it, even if they were trying something different, but if the overall goal was to consolidate and streamline the system to be more upwardly mobile and pro-civic institution, is that something that sounds to you like, yeah, that might be a practical step forward? Let's create more laboratories of innovation at the state level so they can tinker and test out some of these ideas and see if that rises to the top.
I think that's something that could follow the same route that education reform is increasingly taking, so that you now, for the first time, have state-level school choice programs and voucher programs, which as recently as 20 years ago would have been seen as pipe dreams. But they have started to happen, and they've started to happen because of parallel kinds of things. Public education has gotten so bad in so many parts of the country that you just couldn't couldn't make the case any longer against homeschooling. You couldn't make the case any longer against vouchers. And the same thing you can argue is happening with the safety net and social programs. And so, for example, it would be great if you had opt-out options for states. It's that we are going to opt out of the food stamp program and the WIC program and such, and take the cash for those, and we are going to do X with it, which will basically provide for the nutritional needs that the food stamp program pretends to provide for and doesn't actually do. You were talking about innovative programs. I would be more inclined to make it so that some states are way more attractive places to live than other states. And Utah, as far as I can tell, is in the midst of that situation where lots of people want to come to Utah these days for reasons that, unfortunately, I'm afraid require views that the people who are moving into the state don't hold. I mean, it's the story of people from blue states moving into red states for the good things that the red states have done and bringing their politics with them from California. But let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's talk about the marketplace of good places to live. And lo and behold, maybe it will be that the good places to live are the places that take these alternative routes that the federal government is afraid to take.
Charles, the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up, and we just have a minute or two left, is for anyone who considers themselves a champion of upward mobility or opportunity, and I put myself in that category where my part of what drives my professional work is this vision that no one in America should be poor or struggling to achieve the American dream because of bad public policy or limited opportunity. Fundamentally, we need to orient our country and our state towards that being true. For anyone who sort of considers themselves in that category, what advice would you give as we move forward to have these conversations about reform and big ideas? Give us some advice for what's next.
It's the strategy that I started using in Losing Ground and have been trying to pursue ever since. When I wrote Losing Ground, the conservatives and liberals had separate narratives that they were supposed to conform to. So you had the liberals were bleeding heart liberals who really were muddle-headed about things, but at least they had good intentions. And the conservatives were people who are stingy and just want to save money, whereas the conservatives say, no, I want to get rid of the welfare queens that are living off us. And so my theme in Losing Ground was the people who were hurt by the war on poverty were poor people, that we changed the rules of the game that was incredibly destructive. And I cannot tell you how many people have come up to me since about Losing Ground and other things I've written and said, you explained how it is I felt, but I couldn't articulate, or that nobody else was saying. I think I ended Losing Ground that these reforms will occur not because stingy people have won, but because generous people have come to their senses. And generosity, help for your people, for your friends and neighbors in need, these are assets that by we now I'm talking about people on the right, often exemplify in our own lives, and we simply need to do a better job of convincing everyone that this is a source of living a rich life that should be equally available to all.
Well, we are at time, so we'll leave it there. I'd love to keep talking to you about this for hours and hours, but we have just the time we have today. Thank you so much for lending your time and expertise with us. Again, The book is in our hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State. We'll include it in the show notes. Dr. Charles Murray, thanks so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
All right, folks, we're going to take one final break before we leave you all with some final talking points. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. First, I want to thank Charles Murray for lending his time and expertise to our discussion today. Many years ago, I read some of his early work on addressing poverty and reforming the social safety net, and it stuck with me ever since. So I was glad to hear his proposal for why and how we need robust aspirational reform to the current social welfare system. And I will admit, I'm still not quite fully sold that a universal basic income is the way to go. But part of what we do here on Defending Ideas is explore concepts that make us think and ultimately still help us to better articulate the principles we do hold so that we can be champions of sound ideas and good reforms to government policy. So here's my main takeaway from the discussion today. I think it's abundantly clear that we do need significant reform to the current social welfare system for a few reasons. First, the system too often acts as a trap that can actually keep people stuck in poverty rather than acting as a true springboard to upward mobility. That's something we've discussed at length in past episodes when we've covered work disincentives like benefit cliffs. Second, the system is incredibly expensive and difficult to administer while holding to outcomes that are worthy of the investment of taxpayer dollars. And third, we need to rethink how we help poor families move closer to the American dream in this country and orient those conversations toward work-based self-reliance and human dignity as the North Star. Some of what Charles Murray said today may be compelling to you. Some of it may not, but what I hope is compelling is that we all should be engaged in a movement pushing for broad reforms toward this aspirational goal. No one in America should be stuck in poverty or struggling to achieve the American dream because of bad public policy or lack of opportunity. I truly believe that we can make that a reality, and I hope you'll join me in that effort. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles, or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.